Why do we actually need compliance? You probably heard that phrase before. And of course, there's always the question, what are the benefits, but also what are the barriers they put up? And we have to talk about regulatory and compliance today, because I received quite a number of emails where people said, do we actually need it? And if so, how can we work together in a better way than we do today? Let's face it, compliance is omnipresent. Compliance is anywhere. There is no sane organization which works without compliance. From a certain size, you always have compliance people dealing with the matters in that area. The problem is that often people do not like compliance. Often people say, well, they're a bit of a burden. I don't like to work with them. And what people often say is they do not understand the business. They are very good at putting up rules, but as soon as you would only take a slight look into reality, you would very quickly know it's not really how it works. So thank you very much for the rule, which is totally not applicable to what we do here. But now we have to deal with it, and it's another burden in closing business. The reality then, and the result is that often people avoid working with compliance. There's a lack of proactivity on both sides, and people from the business and from compliance, which of course both should work together. Often people work against each other. The reason or the result of that is that people often say, back in the days we had fun and today we have compliance. You may have heard that phrase before. How can we deal with that better? That's the topic of today's episode. Compliance, of course, the first question is, what is the definition of compliance? Compliance deals with the conformity of all processes and business aspects within a certain entity. The entity might be a public service department. The entity might be a publicly listed PLC, stock exchange listed organization, but also a privately run limited company. Can be anything in between. And you have people in these organizations who specifically deal with compliance issues called the compliance officers. And now, of course, we should first look into why is compliance important. I give you by the way, all of these examples which I'm mentioning now are all real world examples. 3 reasons why we need compliance. And then we have to look at how can we work together way better than we do today. Step number 1 is, why do we need compliance? First example is the exaggerated expenses that probably some of you know from the past. You have a certain client that comes to you and you, of course, want to cover their costs. And the question is, where do they stay? You could, of course, say, well, we just cover the hotel costs. And then someone will say, yeah, maybe they also need breakfast, so we cover hotel costs and breakfast. And then someone says, maybe they arrive a bit early, so we cover the dinner the night before, then the stay and the breakfast. And then someone says, it's a bit out of season at the moment, so I think we get a good deal in this wellness hotel. So they can do a bit of wellness, which is included in the stay. And it's still quite close to the seminar center where we work or to the place where we conduct our business. So it's nothing else than covering the cost, is it? And you see how things transition from a focus on just stay here and let's do business to let's have more of an event factor, more of an experience, which you connect, of course, emotionally with your brand. And quite quickly, people will say that is difficult. And when we move from aspect number 1 to aspect number 2 is how to deal with clients. Because, of course, you say we just covered the cost. But when you talk about the cost of a stay, someone says breakfast, where most people would say that that's probably reasonable. Dinner the night before heavily depends on how far do they have to travel, which means of travel are available. And when you talk about the wellness department, that is, or the wellness facilities in that hotel, people probably would say, well, that's borderline bribery, isn't it? And the question is it? Probably yes, probably no, and that's where the argument begins. How to deal with clients, you need rules. However, you need adaptable rules. I'll give you a very simple example. When you, for example, say, we have a rule how expensive a hotel stay can be, and I have that in my organization as well. It's 150 euros, which can be used in any way for the people when they stay somewhere. Of course, I am aware that sometimes that is not enough. When you, for example, go to the London Book Fair, or when the Olympics suddenly take place, or when you decide you go to Oktoberfest with your clients, then of course, with 150 euros, you probably end up in a youth hostel where you preferably do not want to stay and they are booked out a year in advance anyway. So what you need to define is what are the rules and how are they applicable in real world practice. And some organizations are very strict. They simply say there is one amount of money and you have to deal with it. Every single expo, every single fair. I meet people who say, I have an hour and a half car drive to the expo ground because our compliance team doesn't allow me to book a hotel which is closer to the expo ground. Surprise, surprise, you demotivate people by doing that. People call in sick or they deny to go to the expo or the fair. You have to see that the reality of the rule always has to be applicable in the reality that your people do in the real world business scenario in which they are. And by the way, often looking into clients' reality is very helpful. When you say, well, the wellness hotel, is it bribery? I give you two examples. When you have a public servant with a public service with a public servant salary, when you cover a $500, pound or euro hotel stay, including wellness, might they be influenced with that? Might that be considered bribery? Most likely, yes, because people would say, with that job, you could never afford something like that by yourself. When you conduct business in the luxury retail space and you have the CEO of a large chain with you who is probably in the multi-million income area, it's of course not bribery, because people would say if they want to go to a wellness hotel, they could probably buy the whole hotel if they like to. They will not be influenced by just having a wellness stay. So you always have to see the reality of the business in context with the rule. And that is the third aspect which we come to right now, the actuality of legal developments. A good compliance officer, a good compliance department, a good compliance team can take care of changing regulation within your industry. It's impossible for you to keep up with all the changes. If you, for example, work in the food industry or in the gambling industry or in the tobacco industry, the alcohol industry, or if you have to do anything with humans or travel or let's say payments, when payments go across the world digitally, highly regulated industries where changes are omnipresent every single day. And that's, by the way, why some people say we don't have a compliance officer internally. We have external compliance officers who take care of that. And that's fair from a certain size of the organization. Often companies decide to have it more internally, also due to the costs involved. Always be sure that people stay neutral. But now, of course, we have to look into what does the application reality mean for compliance and what does it mean for people who work in the organization. Let's talk about compliance first. Three aspects I will cover with both sides of the compliance team and of the people who work in the business. First, when you work for compliance, you have to define and also know the processes. Not knowing how the business works, and I gave you a very simple example here already. When you say we have a rule for hotel stays and there is just one rule that has to fit all of them, hardly ever will that be a good rule. It depends on the country, it depends on the length of the stay, it depends on where they stay, it depends on is there an expo. You have to define these rules properly. Talk to the people who work in the business. They will help you defining the rules in a better way. Of course, you like to keep it simple and people like to have simple rules. However, there's a difference between reduction of complexity, which is good, and oversimplification, which is bad. So be sure that you know the processes and that you know the business which is conducted by your legal entity, by your organization. The second aspect, you have to know the business model in detail and help people define it for the future developments. When people, for example, say, well, back in the days, we could just have nice drinks with clients and today it's all so complicated. On the one hand, that might be true. On the other hand, we know that back in the days, there was a lot of injustice going on. Bribery was happening and today there's a huge number of legal cases still going on against organizations in that field. Do you want to be part of that? Because a good compliance team helps to develop the business model in a sustainable way. When suddenly leaders say, well, I'm a business leader here. I know that you have the best in mind or on your mind when you give me these rules. However, that one salesperson probably overstepped the mark a bit by the expenses toward the client. But we got good business from that. And that's the priority here. You need to know the business model and you need to know the strengths and weaknesses of that. If you do not understand the business model, you will never bring in rules that work. However, you always have to see, sometimes you have to be the unpopular person and say, it might lead to business, but what you do here, according to rule XYZ or legal judgment XYZ, might be illegal. Because often when suddenly press jumps on these matters and there's a big scandal in the press, often people say, how could that happen? I've never seen anything like that. How could we have come that far? Well, the answer often is very simple. Bad leadership. So when you put up rules, and that's aspect number 3, when you put up rules, they must be applicable to real world practice. And you need to have a ladder of escalation. That's how we call it. A ladder of escalation, from having a first chat to a public or official warning, might be private or public, to a meeting with the client to discuss everything in detail. You need to have a ladder of escalation, certain steps of escalation where you simply define what will happen in which circumstances. And when things go wrong, I can tell you that they often go wrong with the client. I give you a very simple example. When a payment provider said, well, we have this one transaction which looks suspicious, and the compliance department of that organization immediately sent a letter, ordered the department executive to send this letter signed and stamped by the department leader, SVP of business XYZ, to the client. You have to show up. We need to talk about this. There was no communication whatsoever before. So the client showed up. The transaction was very quickly cleared up as being not suspicious. And guess which payment provider has not been considered to do business with the year after? Exactly that payment provider. And by the way, the client even said, we have no problem with you checking compliance because that's what we pay you for. We want to be safe on the legal side. However, communication is part of that. If you have no communication and suddenly you go from 0% punishment to 100% punishment, then people will say probably you put your ego first and you want to prove that you are someone of authority. That is not leading to anything sustainable. So put up rules, but they must be applicable in real world practice. And now, of course, we have to talk about what about the people who work in the business. Step 1, acceptance. Regulatory will go stronger and it will become more complicated in the future. There's absolutely zero signs of that not happening. You will have to accept, I have to accept, you have to accept, we all have to accept that regulatory will become more complex. So compliance is helping us. And that means we have to cooperate and not say we work against you and we bring the business in and you refrain and then you should refrain from intervening with that, or you prohibit us to do business because of XYZ. We work together. And that's step number 1, acceptance of compliance. They are here to help when they are good and then when they are well trained. If you hired compliance officers who put their egos first, that's a bad hiring practice. You need compliance officers who are able to understand the business and support the business on the matter of being compliant with the actual laws, regulations, and internal rules. Step number 2, you need to have proactive communication about the aspects going on in the business, also how to interpret the different rules you have, and also how to apply them in real world practice. If you proactively communicate, you will always have better rules and a better communication between the two entities inside the organization. May it be, for example, the sales department and the compliance department. And the third aspect regarding customers. Always work together and cooperate. There is no obey and order mentality applicable even with compliance. Obey and order only happens when they find something where they say it's 99% sure that what happened here was illegal. Then you can say obey and order, and that's probably the only case where it happened, and rarely ever will you find something like that. You always work together because that is the overarching goal, working together internally with the clients and the compliance department. If you do all of that, and I strongly recommend to have regular meetings with compliance, for example, monthly, about updates, developments, discussions, interpretations and applications, and also maybe changes in the ladder of escalations and the steps of escalations following when offenses are uncovered. Also maybe actual cases from real world law scenarios, from high court judgments to simple events that happen within your industry. Having these regular meetings prevents you from being on the other end of the game, suddenly being surprised about something went wrong and anyone says, oh, how could we have ended up here? Well, as I said before, bad leadership and bad business practice. Compliance is there to help you and you are there to help compliance. Together, working together is the goal, and that leads to the best results. And for that, I wish you all the best. And of course, when you now say, well, I have a couple of questions on that, feel free to contact me. nb@nb-networks.com is my email address. And also you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. You find, when you look into the show notes of this podcast, you find all the ways to contact me in the show notes of this podcast. Below everything is mentioned. Of course, when you now say, well, Can't we just talk live? Of course we can. We have live sessions at least once a month. When you go to expert.nb-networks.com, you will see that we have live sessions once a month. You just have to register. You emailed us once. No worries. There's only one email once per week on a Wednesday morning. It's 100% content ad-free guarantee. Within these emails, you find the date, the time, and also the access link to go to our live sessions. I'm looking forward to speaking there with you. It's available in English and German, so feel free to bring international colleagues as well. And the third aspect is the most important one. Apply what you heard in this podcast, because only when you apply what you heard, you will see the positive aspects that you obviously want to see in your organization. And for that, I wish you all the best. Feel free to contact me. I'm available 24/7, always happy to help. And at the end of this podcast, there's only one thing left for me to say. Thank you very much for your time.